Just come across a link on the LBC Facebook group, the LBC radio station, citing research that apparently suggests countries led by men have had worse situation with coronavirus. Now, this has kind of been a popular trope of late. Um, I've seen it in a number of left-leaning sources. I'm not saying LBC's left-wing; they're mixed bag, but yeah, it has been a left-wing trope of late to suggest that women leaders are better because they're women and male leaders are bad. And people who push this narrative, they deny that they're generalizing, but really is. I mean, this research to me on this is categorically saying we can prove that all male leaders are bad and all women leaders are good. Then it's amounting to pseudoscience because what this kind of relies on, I'm not saying it's specific research, but this isn't just this particular report, it's also something that I've been noticing a lot recently. Um, it's taking examples like the United States and Brazil, which are both led by men, of course, and in those cases, very bombastic, controversial men, Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro. Now, in the case of Bolsonaro in particular, his attitude to coronavirus has been a disgrace. An outright denial about it, threatening to punish state governors. Trump done similar thing. I would say in both cases, their leadership has been disgraceful regarding coronavirus and even callous regarding the huge numbers of people who've died. Brazil's become the second country to surpass 100,000 deaths. And there's other examples. Britain, France, Spain, and Italy are all led by men at the moment. Mexico's led by a man, male president. India's led by a man. All these countries have had high death tolls from COVID. And of course, they hold up Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, as being an example of strong female leadership. So, she's sort of become the poster girl over the last year of a strong woman leader. And I'm not saying that's entirely undeserved. I think she probably is a capable leader, and I think she's genuinely popular in New Zealand. But pointing to New Zealand and say, "Oh, look how low the death rates are." New Zealand's got a small population, so the best way to look at something like this would be in proportion. That's what really matters. Let's look at another country, Belgium. Belgium has a woman prime minister. Belgium also has proportionally one of the highest death tolls, not just in Europe, but in the world. I understand over 10,000 deaths. Scotland, okay, it's at devolved level, but it's led by a woman, Nicola Sturgeon. Um, and on the surface, it's handled COVID better than England has. Um, but it still has a higher death rate than Australia, which has a bigger population and is led by a man. Around the world, you will find, the focus has been on big countries like the United States, Brazil, India. But if you look around the world, there's about 200 countries in the world, and there are many countries with very low death rates that are led by men. Most of the world is run by men, right? Um, so you have to look at it in that context. In other words, countries that have higher death tolls are more likely to be led by men simply because there are more men. That is not in itself proof that male leaders are bad, because you also have countries led by men, male prime ministers, male presidents, that have had low death rates. Maybe Rwanda. Rwanda, for example, has been praised for their handling of the crisis. And I know Paul Kagame is a controversial figure, but they're obviously doing something right. They acted very fast. Rwanda's been described as the Switzerland of Africa, a country that once had connotations with genocide is now enjoying a fairly good reputation in many areas. Um, so I just think it's too simplistic to say women leaders good, male leaders bad. Um, and it's fundamentally sexist. It's something that feminists push to try and kind of say, oh, well, give us girls a chance because you men have screwed things up, you know? Um, but I honestly think you have to look at each case on its own basis. I think the reason the United States and Brazil have had so many deaths, particularly Brazil, is because those particular leaders had a really bad attitude to the pandemic. Bolsonaro denied it. Bolsonaro threatened state governors. So those state governors who were trying to do the best for for their constituents, some of them are men. Um, I just think it's a lazy argument, and I don't think there's much basis for it except to point out well-known examples. But I would say you need to look across the board. You need to look at every country. Now, if it was a case that every country led by women had very low death rates, then you might say, okay, there's something in that. But that's not the case. Like I say, Belgium and Scotland are just two examples of countries led by women that have high death rates, proportionally speaking. And yes, Scotland's lower than England, but it's also higher than a lot of countries that happen to be led by men. Now, I don't make the claim those countries have lower death rates because they're led by men. That would be sexist. So I don't see why feminists should get away with this propaganda that just because New Zealand, led by a woman, has low death rates, then that somehow equates to women are better. It's a lazy argument. I mean, I think it's inflammatory. It would be like saying white people are better. I don't see what it achieves. I really don't. And just because it's research, just because it has that academic label, doesn't mean it's flawless. I'd like to know what criteria they're using exactly, because clearly they're not looking at the whole picture. So this trope just doesn't help anyone. It may be for Jacinda Ardern admirers, and I'm not attacking her. I'm not saying she's a bad leader. I think she's probably a very capable leader. I'm just saying that you can't use one example or even several examples and say, oh, well, that proves women are better. There are many, many examples in the 20th century of female leaders doing bad things. It's not because they were women, it's just because they were personally not good leaders. You get other examples of inspiring women leaders. So the bottom line is equality means equality. You cannot say that women are better because they're women. And this is an example of obvious double standards. Because if men made these sort of claims, like male leaders are better, they would be absolutely lambasted, and rightly so, because it's not accurate. Um, so no, feminists, you can't just say women are better because they're women, and you can't even say, "Oh, well, look at these examples," because it is not showing the whole situation. At least 200 countries in the world. So look at the whole picture. Don't just point to well-known examples and say that proves it. Incidentally, I think what we're starting to see is that at the start of this pandemic, the death rates and the cases were high in developed countries, particularly in Western Europe and North America, which is still the case, but we're starting to now see an emergence of a growing number of cases in developing countries, or at least middle income countries like Mexico and India. I think this thing isn't going to go away anytime soon, and I think we're going to see increasing death rates in developing countries. Um, because for one thing, the way that COVID is registered in every country differs, and in many parts of the world, where there's crippling poverty, not everyone is even going to be recognized. If you have a densely populated slum, how on earth do you accurately measure how many people may or may not have COVID? So I don't think we'll ever know for sure how many people have died from this or how many people were infected. I mean, even today, with Spanish influenza, the 1918 pandemic, it's still quite wide guesstimates, somewhere between a low of 40 million to a high of 50 million. That tends to be the range. Um, but ultimately, you can't, these so called reports and research, I question what's their motivation. I really do. Is it meant to be a serious scientific study or is it just sex baiting? which is no better than race baiting. Um, if you're a feminist who thinks women are better because they're women, you're a sexist. Simple as that.